Imagine the look on a man's face when he believes the entire fortune of his late father is now his. Millions in property, land, and stocks. He walks into the lawyer's office, wearing his best suit, his chin high, already picturing himself at the top of the world. He even rehearses a smug little speech in his head about how he'll take care of everyone now that he's rich. But then, his sister clears her throat. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't even look at him at first. She just calmly pulls out a folded set of papers. Documents no one expected her to have. Papers that change everything. In that moment, his face drains of color. The smirk disappears, and all the confidence he carried evaporates as he realizes the fortune he thought was his, gone. His father had written a different will, one that exposed secrets, betrayals, and choices that would tear this family apart in the most humiliating way possible. And the cruelest twist? The man who thought he'd inherited millions walked out of that office with nothing. This is the story of greed, betrayal, and a shocking family secret that shattered everything. When Thomas Morgan walked into the law office of Kensington and Blythe, he was dressed like a king. His navy suit was freshly pressed, his silk tie gleamed, and he carried himself as though the city belonged to him. At 38 years old, Thomas had spent most of his adult life waiting for this moment, the day he would finally inherit his father's massive estate. Edward Morgan, the family patriarch, had been a man of incredible wealth and power. He owned real estate across the country, held shares in multiple corporations, and had properties overseas. To most, he was a respected businessman. To his children, he was both a father and a figure impossible to please. But Thomas always believed he was the chosen one, the eldest son, the one who had worked closest with Edward, the one who surely his father would trust with the family fortune. As he entered the office, he noticed his younger sister Claire, already seated near the mahogany conference table. Unlike Thomas, Claire wasn't dressed to impress. She wore a simple navy dress, her brown hair tied back neatly. No flashy jewelry, no smug grin, just calm, quiet eyes that followed Thomas as he strode in. "Claire," Thomas said with a curt nod, as though acknowledging a secretary. "Thomas," she replied softly. He didn't sit right away. He stood by the window, looking out at the skyline, imagining how much of it would soon belong to him, at least indirectly. He pictured the cars he would buy, the estate he'd expand, the respect he would command. The lawyer, Mr. Blythe, an older man with silver hair and a voice smooth from years of negotiations, entered the room with a thick envelope in hand. "Thank you both for coming," Mr. Blythe said. "Today we will review the last will and testament of your father, Edward Morgan." Thomas smiled, already rehearsing his victory speech. But across the table, Claire sat silently, her hands folded over her lap, her expression unreadable. She had something Thomas did not expect, something she had been holding back for this very moment. Mr. Blythe cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses as he carefully slid the thick envelope open. The room fell silent, except for the rustling of paper. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, folding one leg over the other, already smug in his certainty that he was about to be named heir to everything. According to the will of Edward Morgan, the lawyer began, his assets, properties, and investments are to be distributed as follows. Thomas's lips curved into a grin. He shot a sideways glance at Claire, almost daring her to react. But she didn't move. She didn't blink. 50% of all holdings will go to his son, Thomas Morgan. Thomas exhaled, loud and victorious. He tapped the table twice with his fingers, as if to say, "Of course, I told you so." And the remaining 50% will be transferred into a trust to be overseen by his daughter, Claire Morgan, for purposes of philanthropy, education, and charitable works. For the first time, Thomas's smile faltered. His head snapped toward the lawyer. "What? Mr. Blythe continued smoothly, as though he hadn't noticed Thomas's shock. "Your father made it clear. Half of his estate would not be for private gain, but to support causes your sister deemed worthy. Claire, you will serve as trustee, with full authority to allocate funds as you see fit." Thomas slammed his palm against the polished mahogany table. "That's ridiculous. My father would never hand over half his fortune to charity, and under Claire's control, no less. This has to be a mistake." Mr. Blythe raised a brow. "These are his signed and notarized wishes. There is no mistake." But Thomas wasn't listening. He was seething, glaring at Claire as though she'd stolen something right out of his hands. "You knew about this, didn't you?" he accused. Claire's calm gaze met his. "I knew Father wanted to make a difference. He didn't want his life's work to vanish into greed." The word greed stung like a slap. Thomas's jaw tightened. "You manipulated him," whispered in his ear when he was too weak to think straight. Mr. Blythe interrupted firmly. "Edward Morgan was of sound mind when he signed this will. His wishes are clear." For a moment, Thomas felt the ground beneath him shift. He still had millions, yes, but only half of what he expected. Half of what he deserved. In his mind, this wasn't just about money. It was about control, power, dominance, and Claire had just stolen it. But what Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this was only the beginning, because Claire wasn't done. She hadn't come to simply sit and nod at the reading of their father's will. She had something far more devastating. As the lawyer shuffled the papers back into the envelope, Claire reached into her own bag. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled out a smaller, leather-bound folder. She placed it on the table. "What's this?" Thomas demanded. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "The real papers." Thomas's face twisted in confusion. Mr. Blythe frowned, leaning forward as Claire pushed the folder toward him. He opened it, and his eyes widened. These are signed, notarized, and dated after the copy we just read." He looked from Claire to Thomas. "This changes everything." Thomas's stomach dropped. He felt his palms go sweaty. He leaned forward, voice cracking with panic. "What do you mean it changes everything?" Claire finally allowed herself a small smile. A smile that promised the nightmare was only beginning for her brother. Mr. Blythe adjusted his glasses again, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the folder Claire had given him. His years in law had taught him to mask emotion, to remain neutral, no matter the drama in the room. But even he couldn't hide the shock flickering across his face. "These documents," he said carefully, are Edward Morgan's most recent testament. They are dated 2 months after the version we just read." Thomas shot to his feet, his chair screeching backward. No, that's impossible. I know the will. I've seen it. Father made it clear I was his heir." Claire's eyes didn't leave her brother. "You saw the old one, not the final one." Mr. Blythe cleared his throat, his voice steady but firm. "For the record, these documents are valid. Edward Morgan signed them before 2 witnesses and had them notarized. The changes here are significant." He looked at Claire, then at Thomas, before reading aloud. I, Edward Morgan, hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils, and declare this to be my last will and testament. I leave the majority of my estate, including properties, accounts, and investments, to my daughter, Claire Morgan. My son, Thomas Morgan, will receive a bequest of— The lawyer paused, blinking, as if unable to believe the words himself. $1. The silence that followed was deafening. The city noise outside seemed to fade into nothing. Thomas's mouth fell open. He looked as though the air had been punched out of his lungs. $1? He repeated, his voice trembling with disbelief. That's a joke, right? Some kind of sick joke? Mr. Blythe shook his head solemnly. It is not a joke. This is legally binding. Your father left instructions that you were to receive only $1 symbolic from his estate. Claire exhaled slowly, as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. For months she had carried this secret, waiting for this very moment. The moment when her brother's arrogance would shatter into dust. Thomas's face turned red, veins bulging at his temple. You tricked him! You poisoned his mind against me! But Claire's voice was calm, almost sorrowful. No, Thomas. Father knew exactly what he was doing. He saw you for who you really are. Greedy, selfish, ruthless. And he wanted to make sure his life's work didn't die in your hands. Thomas's fist slammed against the table, rattling the glasses of water. He turned on Mr. Blythe, spitting his words like venom. This can't stand. I'll fight it in court. I'll destroy this fraud. Do you hear me? But Mr. Blythe raised a hand. You're free to contest it, but I assure you, the evidence is strong. Your father's reasoning was documented. He stated, in writing, that he believed leaving you control of his fortune would be destructive, not only to the estate, but to the family's legacy. Thomas staggered backward, almost tripping over his chair. His entire life, his fantasies of power, wealth, and status, crumbled before him in an instant. And yet, Claire wasn't done. Because hidden within those pages wasn't just the change of inheritance. It was something far worse. Something personal. Something that would expose the real reason Edward Morgan had cut his son out of the will. Claire sat back, watching her brother unravel, knowing that the next page of that testament would destroy him in ways money never could. Thomas's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. His hands shook as he tried to process the humiliation. Disinherited, stripped of everything he believed was rightfully his. Reduced to a single, mocking dollar. But then Mr. Blythe's voice broke the silence again. His tone was more cautious now, as though he knew the words on the page would cut deeper than any blade. There is an additional section, the lawyer said slowly. Your father left an explanation for his decision. Thomas's head snapped up. Explanation? His voice cracked with rage. Let me hear it. Let me hear what lies Claire fed him. Mr. Blythe unfolded the final sheet, his eyes scanning the neatly typed lines. Then he began to read aloud. To my son, Thomas Morgan, I leave only $1, not out of cruelty, but as a symbol of what your choices have cost you. I cannot in good conscience entrust you with the wealth I built, knowing how recklessly and selfishly you have lived your life. You have squandered opportunities, betrayed those who trusted you, and most painfully, you have betrayed me. Thomas's knees went weak. He gripped the back of the chair, his voice trembling. Betrayed him? What is he talking about? Claire didn't move. She kept her gaze steady, though her lips pressed into a thin line. She already knew what was coming. Blythe continued, "You may have thought your actions were hidden, Thomas, but I knew. I knew about the forged signatures. I knew about the business accounts you drained for your own gain. And I knew about the property you secretly sold behind my back, pocketing the profits while pretending to be loyal." Thomas's face turned ashen. His eyes darted wildly, as if looking for an escape route. No, that's not true. He's lying. I never—" But Mr. Blythe's voice pressed on, merciless. "A father sees more than his children realize. I gave you chance after chance to change. But instead, you chose greed. You chose betrayal. And so I choose to leave my legacy in the hands of the one child who has shown honor, compassion, and strength, my daughter, Claire." The words hung heavy in the air, like the toll of a funeral bell. Thomas shook his head violently, sweat beading across his forehead. "You," he turned on Claire, his voice hoarse, "you put this in his head. You convinced him I betrayed him. You're the reason he cut me out." Claire's eyes softened, though there was no pity in her voice. "No, Thomas, you did that yourself. Father only wrote down the truth, and deep down, you know it." For a moment, Thomas could only stare at her. His chest heaved with fury and shame, his pride burning to ashes, in front of the one person he had always looked down upon. But the humiliation wasn't over, because Claire, calm and collected, leaned forward slightly and added, "There's something else you should know, something Father left, only for me to reveal." She reached into the folder again, this time pulling out a sealed envelope with her name written in Edward Morgan's hand. She slid it across the table toward Mr. Blythe. Thomas's eyes widened. "What is that?" Claire's voice was low, deliberate. "The final piece of Father's truth. And when you hear it, Thomas, it will explain why your inheritance was never going to be yours." Mr. Blythe carefully broke the seal, and as his eyes scanned the handwritten letter inside, his expression changed, sharpening into something graver, something that hinted at a revelation neither Thomas nor Claire had fully anticipated. Mr. Blythe unfolded the handwritten letter, the crisp paper trembling slightly between his fingers. The weight of what was written there seemed to settle over him like a storm cloud. He hesitated for a long moment before clearing his throat. "This letter," he said carefully, "was written by your father in his own hand. It contains personal revelations that go beyond the distribution of assets." Thomas gritted his teeth. "Read it." Claire folded her hands in her lap, bracing herself. Mr. Blythe began, "To my children, if you are hearing these words, it means I am gone. I have left Claire with this letter because she deserves the truth. Both of you do. For years, there have been secrets in this family. Choices I made that carried heavy consequences. Thomas, I know you always believed I favored you. Perhaps in your younger years, I did. But that favoritism blinded me to your flaws. I excused your recklessness. I turned away from your lies. I told myself you would grow into the man I hoped you'd be. Instead, you betrayed me, and worse, you betrayed your sister." Thomas's brow furrowed, his voice breaking through the silence. "Betrayed her? What does that mean?" Claire's expression didn't change, though her knuckles whitened around each other. She already knew. Mr. Blythe went on, "Years ago, when your mother passed, Claire was still young. She trusted you. I discovered later that you pressured her into signing over her share of Mother's estate under the promise you would protect it for her. But instead, you sold those assets and pocketed the money. Claire never confronted you, perhaps out of fear or love for her brother. But I knew, and it was then I realized I could not leave my legacy in your hands." Thomas staggered backward, as though the words themselves had struck him. His voice rose, desperate, panicked. "That's a lie. She gave me those papers willingly. She didn't even want the land. She. His words faltered as the memory clawed at him. He had convinced Claire to sign the papers when she was barely out of her teens. She had been too naive, too trusting. He had promised he would take care of everything, and then he sold their mother's land within months. Claire finally spoke, her voice calm but heavy with emotion. "I never confronted you, Thomas. In parts I let it go because I thought maybe you needed it more than I did. But Father knew. He always knew." Mr. Blythe's voice trembled slightly as he read the final lines. "Thomas, by betraying your sister, you betrayed your mother's memory. I cannot entrust you with the empire I built, for I know you would destroy it. Claire, you were the quiet strength in this family, the one who endured silently while others took. Now, you are the one I trust to carry the Morgan name forward with honor." The lawyer folded the letter and set it on the table, his eyes heavy with the weight of what he had just delivered. The room was thick with silence. Thomas's face was pale, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words that refused to come. He looked at Claire, really looked at her, for the first time in years. The sister he had dismissed, underestimated, manipulated. The sister who now sat holding everything. "You," his voice cracked, half rage, half desperation. "You ruined me." Claire's eyes glistened, but her voice was unshakable. "No, Thomas, you ruined yourself. All I did was let the truth come out." And for the first time in his life, Thomas Morgan realized his kingdom of lies had finally collapsed. Thomas's chest heaved as if the air itself had turned to poison. His eyes darted from the lawyer to the letter, then back to Claire, who sat there with maddening calm. For years, he had thought of her as weak, submissive, forgettable. But now, sitting in that office, she looked like the one holding all the power. And that thought burned him alive. Mr. Blythe slid the letter back into the envelope and folded his hands. "The will, the letter, and all supporting documents will be filed with the probate court. Unless contested, Claire will assume immediate control of the estate." The word control was like gasoline on Thomas's fire. His voice cracked into a yell. "No, this isn't over. You think I'll just stand here and watch her steal everything that should be mine? I'll fight it. I'll take this to court. I'll drag you all down with me if I have to." Claire didn't flinch. "You can try, but Father left every safeguard in place. Witnesses, recordings, legal proof. He knew you would contest it. He prepared for you." Thomas's face twisted with fury. He lunged toward her, slamming his hands on the table so hard the glasses rattled. "You've always wanted this, haven't you? You played the innocent little sister, but you were waiting for him to hand it all to you while I did the work." Claire looked up at him steadily, her voice calm but cutting. "The only thing you ever worked for was yourself, Thomas. You never built, you only took." Her words sliced deeper than she knew. For Thomas, it wasn't just about the money. It was about pride, about being seen as the heir, the man who would carry his father's legacy. Now, that image had shattered, and the one person who stood in its place was the sister he had always dismissed. Mr. Blythe's voice was firm, final. "Unless you have further questions, we are done here." But Thomas didn't move. He stood there, trembling with rage, glaring at his sister. And in that moment, a dangerous thought rooted itself in his mind. If the courts wouldn't give him what he wanted, maybe there was another way. Claire, sensing the storm in his eyes, stood slowly and gathered her things. "This is over, Thomas. Father chose. Accept it and find a way to live with dignity. It's not too late." Thomas leaned close, his voice a venomous whisper only she could hear. "Oh, Claire, it's far too late for that. You may think you've won, but you've just declared war." Her heart thudded once in her chest. She met his gaze, unflinching, though a shadow of unease passed across her face. Thomas watched her walk out of the office with her head high, the weight of their father's empire now resting squarely on her shoulders. And in the echo of her footsteps, he made himself a silent promise. If he couldn't inherit the fortune, then he would destroy it, and her along with it. The city lights blurred outside the tinted windows of Thomas's car as he sat in the back seat, fists clenched tight. The driver dared not speak. Thomas's entire body shook, not from grief, but from rage. He replayed the scene in the lawyer's office over and over. Claire's calm eyes, her soft but steady voice, the way she slid those papers across the table, like a dagger she had been hiding for years. And the humiliation, oh, the humiliation, of being reduced to $1 while his sister walked away with everything. It wasn't just money she had taken from him. It was his identity, his legacy, his very place in the family. By the time he reached his penthouse apartment, his rage had crystallized into resolve. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, downed it in one gulp, and paced across the marble floor. He had two choices: accept the humiliation and live the rest of his life in his sister's shadow, or fight back. Thomas had never been one to accept defeat. He started making calls. First, to a friend at a law firm notorious for dragging out probate cases with endless motions. Then to an old business partner who knew how to bury financial records and paperwork so deep they became almost impossible to trace. And finally, to a man he hadn't spoken to in years, a fixer, someone who specialized in solving problems quietly. Each call stitched together the beginnings of a plan. If Claire thought she could manage the estate, he would overwhelm her with lawsuits, audits, and fabricated debts. He would bleed the fortune dry with legal battles. He would whisper to business partners that she was inexperienced, reckless, untrustworthy. He would paint her as a fraud. And if that didn't work, he would dig deeper. Because Thomas knew things about the Morgan family. Secrets even Claire might not be aware of. Skeletons buried in the closets of their empire. If he couldn't claim the fortune, he would scorch the earth until there was nothing left to inherit. He swirled another drink in his glass, the amber liquid catching the light. His lips twisted into a smile that held no humor. "She thinks she's won," he muttered to himself. "But she has no idea what's coming." Meanwhile, across town, Claire sat at her kitchen table with the letter from her father laid neatly before her. For her, the inheritance wasn't a victory to savor. It was a burden to carry. She knew Thomas wouldn't walk away quietly. She knew his pride wouldn't allow it. And as the night grew darker, she whispered to herself, "Father, I'll protect what you built, even if it means protecting it from Thomas." Neither of them slept that night. One was plotting to destroy. The other was preparing to defend. The war had begun. The first blow came quietly, like the whisper of a knife sliding out of its sheath. One morning, barely a week after Claire had stepped into her new role as executor of the Morgan estate, she was greeted by a thick envelope on her doorstep. Inside was a summons. Thomas had officially contested the will. Claire's stomach nodded, though she wasn't surprised. Her father had warned her this would happen. She phoned Mr. Blythe, who assured her the case was airtight. "Your father documented everything. Thomas doesn't have a chance," the lawyer said. But Thomas hadn't filed the lawsuit to win. He filed it to bleed her dry. Within days, newspapers picked up the story. Morgan heir cut out of will, claims fraud. The tabloids devoured it. Talk shows speculated endlessly about a family war, painting Claire as a manipulative sister who had stolen her brother's inheritance through trickery. Reporters camped outside her office, shoving microphones in her face. "Claire, did you manipulate your father into cutting Thomas out? How do you respond to your brother's accusations that you schemed to take it all?" She said nothing. Silence was her only shield, though each headline cut her deeper. Behind the scenes, Thomas was reveling in the chaos. Sitting in his penthouse with a glass of scotch, he watched the news anchors replay his side of the story. He had given carefully rehearsed interviews, tears brimming in his eyes, his voice breaking as he spoke about a sister who betrayed him and a dying father too weak to resist her influence. The public, hungry for drama, ate it up. But Thomas wasn't done. He unleashed auditors on the estate, digging into every corner of the Morgan finances. He hired investigators to leak half-truths and rumors about Claire's personal life. Claims of secret relationships, shady dealings, mismanagement of funds. Each lie was dressed up just enough to sound believable. Claire, meanwhile, worked late into the night, combing through documents, preparing defenses, meeting with lawyers. She barely slept, barely ate, yet through it all, she carried her father's letter with her, reading it whenever the pressure felt unbearable. His words reminded her that the fight was not just for wealth, it was for their family's honor. One evening, as she left her office, she found her car window smashed. On the driver's seat lay a single dollar bill, taped to a note in her brother's handwriting. $1, Claire. That's all you're worth. Enjoy it while it lasts." Her hands shook as she held the note. The message was clear. Thomas wasn't just fighting her in court. He was declaring psychological war. And yet, Claire knew something Thomas didn't. The more desperate he became, the more reckless he would get. And reckless men always left trails. The question was, how far would her brother go to tear her down? Thomas's smear campaign had rattled Claire, but it hadn't broken her, and that infuriated him. The lawsuits dragged on. The headlines churned. But despite his best efforts, Claire stood her ground with quiet resilience. She didn't rise to his bait, didn't snap back in public, didn't let the lies twist her into something she wasn't. To Thomas, that calmness felt like a taunt, like she was saying, "You can't touch me." And so he decided, if he couldn't destroy her with lies, he would destroy her with truth. Because Thomas had kept things buried for years, things his father had never discovered, things even Claire didn't know. And now, he was ready to dig them up and weaponize them. Late one night, he sat alone in his study, surrounded by old family files, storage boxes, and stacks of papers. Dust coated the folders, but Thomas knew exactly what he was looking for. After hours of searching, he found it, a thin, weathered file marked only with their mother's initials. He flipped it open, and a cruel smile spread across his face. Inside were adoption records. Claire Morgan was not, by blood, a Morgan at all. Thomas stared at the documents, his laughter echoing bitterly through the empty room. Their father had adopted Claire as a baby after marrying her mother. She had no biological claim to the fortune. None. And yet, Edward had given her everything. "This is it," Thomas whispered, clutching the papers with trembling hands. "This is how I burn her down." The next morning, Claire walked into her office to find another envelope waiting for her. But this one wasn't from a court. It was from Thomas. She opened it slowly, her heart sinking as she read the words, "You're not a real Morgan, and soon the whole world will know." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She sank into her chair. The adoption documents spread before her like a weapon ready to strike. Her father had never told her. He had loved her, raised her, trusted her, but he had kept this secret locked away. Now Thomas had unearthed it and was prepared to use it to destroy her legitimacy in the eyes of the world. For the first time, Claire felt the weight of doubt. What if the courts listened to him? What if the public believed she had no right to the estate? But even through the panic rising in her chest, one thought anchored her. Father chose me, not because of blood, but because of who I am. Still, she knew Thomas wouldn't stop here. He had found a weapon, and he was going to use it. And when he did, the scandal would be explosive enough to tear the entire Morgan legacy apart. The story hit the papers like wildfire. "Claire Morgan, not a real Morgan," screamed the headlines. Talk shows debated her legitimacy. Tabloids plastered childhood photos beside bold captions. "Adopted heiress at center of fortune feud." Thomas made sure the leak was explosive. He sat for interviews, painting himself as the betrayed son. "My father lied to the world. My sister isn't even family by blood." And yet, he gave her everything. His voice cracked with manufactured pain. "I don't begrudge her existence, but she should never have been favored over me." The public turned divided. Some sympathized with Claire, praising her strength. Others whispered that maybe Thomas was right. For the first time, Claire found herself isolated. Even allies in the business world hesitated to stand too close, unsure of where the scandal would land. But in private, she held the documents close, studying every line. The truth wasn't that she was unwanted. It was that her father had chosen her, deliberately. That choice, she realized, was more powerful than blood. The courtroom was packed the day Thomas's lawyers filed a motion to challenge the will, citing Claire's adoption. Thomas walked in smug, reporters flashing cameras, convinced the law would favor blood over paper. Claire sat across from him, her calm demeanor masking the storm inside. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Morgan, this court is not concerned with genetics. It is concerned with the binding legal documents of Edward Morgan's estate." Thomas's attorney pounced. "Yes, Your Honor, but Edward Morgan deceived this court and the public by not disclosing that his so-called daughter was adopted. We contend that his judgment was clouded, that the will is therefore invalid." A murmur rippled through the room. Claire's lawyer rose, steel in his voice. "Adoption does not erase family." Edward Morgan was clear in his wishes. He gave everything to Claire because she embodied his values, not because of DNA. The adoption papers, legally binding for decades, prove one thing: she is his daughter. Thomas clenched his jaw. The judge did not dismiss the case outright. The battle was far from over. Outside the courtroom, Thomas escalated. He hired investigators, digging deeper into Claire's past. He paid off people who had known her mother, hoping to uncover dirt. Then came the betrayal Claire hadn't expected. An old family friend, Mrs. Callahan, who had once rocked Claire to sleep, now stood on television, claiming Edward never wanted her in the first place. Edward only married her mother out of obligation, she declared. He never loved Claire as his own. The lie cut deeper than Thomas's smear campaigns. This was personal. Claire wept in private. But grief soon hardened into resolve. She began sifting through her father's old letters, journals, and recordings, searching for proof of his love and intention. And one night, in a dusty attic box, she found it. A handwritten note from Edward to her mother, sealed but never sent. Claire is the best thing that has ever happened to me. I will raise her as my daughter in every way. Blood does not make a family. Love does. Claire held it to her chest, tears streaming. It wasn't just a note. It was salvation. In the next court hearing, Claire's lawyer produced the letter. The words silenced the room. The judge read it twice before looking at Thomas with cold disdain. This, the judge said firmly, shows the decedent's clear intent. Mr. Morgan, I caution you against dragging this court into your personal vendettas. Reporters erupted. The narrative shifted. The heiress wasn't illegitimate. She was chosen. But Thomas wasn't finished. He stormed out of the courtroom, vowing to find something else, something bigger. And that's when fate handed him another weapon. Buried in old company records, he discovered shady deals Edward had made decades ago. Deals that, if exposed, could tarnish Claire's claim to being the noble, untouchable heiress. Thomas leaked the documents to the press, land acquisitions Edward had made that displaced poor families, questionable business mergers, and hints of tax manipulation. The world gasped. Suddenly, the Morgan legacy wasn't a beacon of success. It was tainted. For the first time, Claire's image wasn't just under attack, it was crumbling. Investors pulled away, charities distanced themselves, and whispers grew louder. Maybe Thomas was right all along. Maybe Edward chose the wrong heir. Claire felt the weight of her father's sins pressing down on her shoulders. But deep inside, she knew one thing. This wasn't just about her inheritance anymore. It was about defending the truth of who Edward Morgan really was, and who she was destined to be. She stared into the mirror one night, whispering to her reflection, "He thought exposing father's flaws would destroy me, but it's going to destroy him." And with that, she began plotting the counterstrike that would bring Thomas to his knees. Claire knew she couldn't just defend against Thomas anymore. She had to go on the offensive. She dug deeper into her father's archives, determined to separate fact from rumor. Yes, Edward had made deals that hurt people, but Claire uncovered evidence that Thomas himself had benefited. Secret kickbacks, off-the-record transactions. His fingerprints were on the very deals he now weaponized against her. Worse, she discovered Thomas had been siphoning money from Edward's companies for years. Quiet theft, hidden in shell accounts. He wasn't just bitter, he was corrupt. And when she handed those files to her lawyer, she knew the tide was about to turn. The courtroom buzzed as Claire's team presented the new evidence. "Not only has Mr. Thomas Morgan filed baseless claims," her lawyer said, voice booming, "but he has enriched himself illegally, betraying both the company and his late father's trust." The documents hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Thomas's composure cracked for the first time. His smug smile twitched, his hands clenched the table. He hissed to his attorney, "They weren't supposed to find that." But it was too late. The world now saw Thomas not as a wronged son, but as a greedy usurper. Still, he wasn't ready to fold. Rage replaced strategy. If he was going down, he was going to scorch everything around him. Desperate, Thomas turned to his last card, betrayal from within. He approached Claire's closest confidant, her assistant of 10 years, offering money for inside information. The assistant, tempted, handed over private schedules, recordings, and even fragments of Claire's unfinished speeches. With this, Thomas staged a media ambush. He twisted her words, making it appear she planned to sell off parts of the Morgan estate to foreign buyers, betraying her father's legacy. The backlash was immediate. Angry protesters gathered outside her office, shouting her name with venom. Claire sat in silence, the weight of treachery pressing hard. But instead of breaking, she hardened. She told herself, "If Thomas wants war, then I'll give him a war he'll never forget." The final trial date loomed. Thomas swaggered into court, convinced the chaos he'd sown would weaken Claire. But he didn't expect what happened next. Claire's lawyer called a surprise witness, the very assistant Thomas had bribed. On the stand, under oath, guilt dripping from every word, the assistant confessed. "Thomas paid me to betray her. He promised me a future in his company if I helped him destroy Claire." The courtroom gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. Thomas's face turned pale, his empire of lies collapsing brick by brick. Claire sat tall, unflinching. For the first time, the judge's gaze was filled, not with patience, but with anger directed squarely at Thomas. The courtroom was silent when the judge delivered the ruling. Edward Morgan's will is valid. His wishes stand. Claire Morgan is the rightful heir. Gasps, murmurs, reporters rushed out to break the news. Then came the hammer blow. As for Mr. Thomas Morgan, this court refers findings of financial misconduct to the authorities. You sought to defraud this estate and this court. You will face the consequences. Thomas's world shattered. The millions he thought he'd inherit vanished. The respect he craved evaporated. All that remained was a tarnished name and the dollar Edward had deliberately left him. The story ended where it began, in the lawyer's office, papers spread across a heavy oak table. Claire stood there, older now, stronger, carrying the weight of a legacy not defined by blood, but by choice. Thomas sat slumped in the corner, awaiting his fate. His $1 glared back at him, a mocking reminder of what he could have had. "Father knew who you were," Claire whispered, not in anger, but in pity. "That's why he left you nothing. And today, you proved him right." She walked out into the flashing lights of the press, not as a scandal, not as an illegitimate heir, but as the chosen successor of Edward Morgan's empire. The world saw her not as the girl with questionable bloodlines, but as the woman who survived betrayal, lies, and war, and emerged unshaken. Thomas, meanwhile, disappeared from headlines within weeks. Forgotten, ruined, reduced to nothing but the brother who tried to steal it all and lost everything. And as Claire closed the chapter on her family's darkest war, one truth remained. Sometimes, the greatest revenge is not destroying your enemy, but living the life they were too corrupt to deserve.